opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, immediately challenges the center and promises dynamic play. Provoking a clash in the center, Sicilian dragon players often aim to destabilize white's pawn structure and generate queenside counterplay. Initiating the initiative, this knight poised for central action, aiming to disrupt black's flexible pawn structure. Developing the knight here initiates a dynamic contest for central squares and prepares for potential pawn advances, setting the stage for Sicilian skirmishes. Introducing immediate pin and strategic tension, preparing to disrupt black's knight structure. Preparing to fianchetto, black alters the pawn structure's character, potentially complicating white's central ambitions. Sacrificing piece mobility for doubled pawns offers a lasting structural advantage. Reclaiming the pawn with the b-pawn opens a vital diagonal for your queen and offers immediate compensation for the doubled pawns. Securing the king now allows white to focus on exploiting the structural weakness black created on the queen side after the bxc6 pawn move. Securing the fianchettoed bishop offers excellent long-term diagonal pressure and prepares for future development. Preparing to challenge the semi-open b-file and potentially create play against black's doubled pawns, the rook's repositioning signals a strategic intention beyond mere development. Relocating the knight to the edge of the board on h6, though it aims to potentially contest the e4 pawn later or support a kingside expansion, sacrifices valuable central influence and tempo, leaving the kingside less defended. Fortifying the center's pawn chain sets up a potential queenside pawn storm and prepares to deploy the d-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's bishop pair and control more space. Safeguarding the king with castling is a prudent step, securing that vital piece behind a pawn shield and preparing for future piece activity on the open files. However, it somewhat delays development and central influence, potentially allowing white to establish greater control of the e-file and the d4 square, creating a slight imbalance in central dominance that will require careful maneuvering to address. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prevents any immediate g5 invasions, though it subtly concedes a bit of central space and delays development of the queenside pieces. A bold pawn thrust, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and immediately disrupt the calm coordination of white's pieces. This move injects dynamism into the position, forcing white to react to an unbalanced pawn configuration. Black risks creating doubled pawns on the c-file, but in return aims to seize initiative and open lines for their pieces, potentially targeting white's kingside. Solidifying the center and preparing a pawn advance, this move aims to gain a foothold and potentially launch a queenside initiative while reinforcing the d4 square, preventing immediate tactical incursions and creating a more robust pawn structure for white. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, this pawn thrust forcefully expands black's territory, aiming to cramp white's pieces and potentially open a dangerous diagonal for the bishop on g7. However, it creates a potential weakness on d4 and temporarily ties down the knight on c6. Shattering black's pawn chain opens the central files, creating immediate tactical possibilities and a potential weakness on the d6 square. White gains crucial space for maneuverability. Reclaiming the center with this pawn thrust seizes vital space, immediately challenging white's central control and opening diagonal lines for black's bishops. It's a bold maneuver that seeks to disrupt white's harmonious development and initiate active counterplay. Queen exchange unravels the center's structure, simplifying the position and initiating a critical endgame transition. Retrieving the rook from its slumber on the d-file is a sound repositioning, clearing the way for the other rook and preparing to contest the open central file. The rook's journey to e4 is a bold assertion of central control, aiming to exploit the open e-file and pressurize black's vulnerable pawn structure. The pawn storm initiated by e5 suddenly injects vital central activity, challenging white's bishop pair advantage and attempting to seize space on the kingside. A bold gambit given the pawn structure's inherent structural weaknesses that might be exploited later. Refolding the rook to its starting file allows white to immediately challenge the central pawn structure that black has so aggressively built. aiming to disrupt its harmony and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from its advanced position. Solidifying the pawn chain's base with a thematic defensive maneuver aims to prevent white's pieces from infiltrating the queenside, while also preparing to potentially activate the bishop on g7 along the now cleared dark squares. Initiating a knight's journey to secure the central squares and bolster the kingside defenses. The knight retreats to a less active square, perhaps seeking refuge from potential threats or aiming for a more stable position on the kingside. Yet it concedes valuable central space and limits its future mobility significantly. The knight embarks on a journey to the queenside, eyeing the potentially weak pawn on c5 and seeking to control the d4 square, thereby improving the piece's coordination with its counterpart on f3 and preparing for a potential central breakthrough. Unlocking the queenside pawns, a5 aims to create immediate space and prevent white from comfortably advancing their own pawns on that flank, potentially establishing an outpost for the knight on b3. Shaping the central pawn structure now becomes paramount for white, and the bishop's repositioning aims to eye the queenside and potentially support a future b4 advance, aiming for queenside expansion. Creating a foothold for the knight, this maneuver on a4 aims to dislodge white's queenside pawn structure and open up lines of attack. By forcing the b3 pawn to advance, black hopes to create weaknesses that can be exploited later. This could lead to a more active role for black's pieces, particularly the knight on f7, which may find better squares. The intention is to disrupt white's coordination and potentially gain a spatial advantage. The bishop now exerts pressure along the long diagonal, creating a strategic anchor and potentially pinning the knight to the king if the pawn structure shifts. Re-establishing the rook on the central file, black aims to contest the open e-file and prevent white's knight from becoming a significant outpost on b3. The maneuver also prepares to potentially shift the rook to the d-file if white commits their queen's knight, or to support a future pawn push with f5. This response is a logical attempt to equalize the piece activity and maintain dynamic balance in the face of white's slightly more advanced pawn structure. The knight's arrival on c5 is a bold attempt to disrupt black's pawn structure, creating a dynamic presence that could pressure the queenside and potentially target the weak d6 square should the opportunity arise. Harnessing the bishop's diagonal power, black repositions the piece to f5, aiming to disrupt white's knight coordination and prepare for potential pawn advances, subtly increasing pressure along the central files while eyeing the vulnerable d3 square. Launching a knight to the rim often signals a bold repositioning, aiming to exploit the open lines or potential outposts that have emerged. And here, the white knight embarks on a journey towards potentially disrupting black's kingside pawn structure or supporting a central pawn push. Recalibrating piece placement, the bishop retreats, seeking refuge from the knight's active pursuit. Recapturing the central d-file with the rook aims to establish immediate pressure and coordinate pieces for potential activity. White's strategic goal here is to actively contest the open file and prepare for further development, potentially aiming to drive back black's pieces or create pawn weaknesses. The placement on d1 signifies an intention to exert influence along the central corridor, preventing black from consolidating their position without challenge. This also prepares for potential pawn advances or other tactical sequences that might arise from this central control. Reclaiming central space is the immediate, bold objective of this pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and open new avenues for black's army. Re-establishing the knight on its natural outpost on f3 allows white to prepare for a more active central presence, potentially eyeing the d5 pawn or reinforcing the kingside should black attempt an attack there. A bold thrust to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines, though it gambles with pawn integrity and potential weaknesses for the king. This repositioning of the knight to d4 is a strategic masterstroke, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn chain and seize control of key squares that have been neglected. The knight's leap not only pressures the e4 pawn, forcing black to react defensively, but also opens up avenues for further piece development and potential kingside attacks. It's a clear signal that white intends to exploit the slight immobility of black's pieces and create imbalances that can be leveraged for a long-term advantage. The knight's new home on d4 represents a significant shift in the battlefield, potentially leading to a more dynamic and active game for white. Shifting the knight to a central outpost on e5 significantly increases its influence, aiming to exploit the open files and put pressure on white's pawn structure, while also preparing for potential advances on the kingside. Targeting the queenside's structural weaknesses now, white aims to exploit the isolated a pawn and open the b-file for potential penetration. This maneuver forces black to make a decision about their advanced a pawn, potentially leading to a further weakening of their pawn structure if they defend it passively or attempt to advance it. Disrupting white's central pawn structure is the immediate goal, forcing a decision that will define the coming middle game. This capture aims to create an unbalanced pawn situation and potentially open lines for black's pieces, a departure from the symmetrical maneuvering that has characterized the early stages. Opening the file for the rook creates an immediate threat to the advanced black pawn on a4, forcing a reaction and simplifying white's queenside pressure. Reactivating the bishop on f8 sets a trap, luring the knight back into a potentially compromised outpost, while also preparing to contest the open files with a revitalized queen's side presence. Slamming the rook onto the open file, white immediately challenges black's potentially passive piece placement, aiming to exploit the currently undefended a4 pawn and potentially create entry points for the queen or other attacking pieces down the rank. Exchanging the rook off the central file relinquishes the immediate pressure and simplifies the position, creating an endgame where black's doubled pawns on the c-file become a more pronounced weakness. Recapturing the rook with tempo forces the black bishop to retreat, solidifying white's queenside pawn structure and preparing for a potential kingside expansion. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal after the rook exchange is a sound idea, aiming to activate the piece and potentially threaten squares around white's king. Shifting the bishop to that strong outpost on c7 aims to harass the knight and disrupt black's coordination, potentially creating new attacking avenues while simultaneously fortifying white's queenside pawns. Repositioning the knight to d7 aims to improve its piece activity and potentially target the c5 square, while also freeing up the f8 square for the bishop if needed, a subtle shift in defensive posture amidst white's encroaching pieces. Clearing the central tension allows the knight to redeploy with tempo, aiming to dominate the queenside. Reclaiming the bishop on the light squares immediately re-establishes piece harmony for black and prepares to challenge white's control of the open c-file, a vital pathway that white has been so diligently working to exploit. This maneuver aims to secure greater pawn coverage on the queenside, potentially stifling black's advancing light-squared bishop and creating threats down the new b-file. Unlocking the center with this pawn push creates immediate complications, forcing white to reckon with a potentially dynamic pawn chain or face a positional disadvantage. This audacious advance cracks open the position, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure and exploit the open f-file for immediate pressure. Opening the bishop's diagonal to challenge the rook's influence on the a1h8 diagonal introduces a fascinating positional tug-of-war over central control and pawn structure. Focusing the monarch's security becomes paramount as the endgame looms. Repositioning the king to the f1 square initiates a defensive maneuver, anticipating potential pawn pushes and aiming to centralize the king for better piece coordination, while also preparing to support any advance of the h-pawn or defend against threats along the second rank. Unleashing a surprise pawn check, black desperately seeks to disrupt white's solidifying position and force a decisive king confrontation, exploiting the uncovered diagonal towards the white monarch. Seeking safety, the king scrambles to the corner. Abandoning central control after black's well-timed pawn thrust creates a dangerous open diagonal. The bishop repositions to an outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create a potential weakness on the kingside by blockading the king's escape squares. Seizing the open file and centralizing the knight offers a dynamic initiative, forcing black to react and potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure. The bishop's retreat to the c3 square is a crucial maneuver, seeking to engage with the central pawn structure and potentially disrupt white's developing advantage. Observe how this piece's relocation aims to pry open the d-file, a dormant highway that could soon become a battleground for control. Unlocking the king's defenses, b5 now aims to infiltrate the enemy's camp, creating potential threats against the now exposed monarch and forcing black to consider immediate defensive measures. Conceding the bishop on a1 voluntarily, while simultaneously allowing white's knight to occupy the strategically vital d7 square, signals a dramatic shift in black's strategic footing, essentially abandoning any hope of creating dynamic counterplay and instead embracing a passive defensive posture. Asserting control over the 7th rank with the knight, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's recently established bishop outpost and potentially force further concessions. Reclaiming the open file with the rook aims to challenge white's bishop pair advantage and prepare for potential counterplay against the exposed white king. Pushing the b-pawn now forces black to decide if they want to exchange it and weaken their king's safety further, or let white advance and gain valuable central space. Sacrificing the bishop opens a clear path for the pawn, aiming to create a passed threat while simultaneously disrupting white's central control and forcing an immediate response to the advanced e-pawn. The pawn push on e5 opens lines for white's king, creating immediate concerns, yet it also opens the f-file for potential counterplay against black's exposed monarch. The immediate capture of the rook liberates the black king from its shadowy confinement on the 8th rank, initiating a drastic shift in the game's dynamic as the queenside pawns become the new focal point. Opening the b-file now forces the black rook to make a concession, either allowing white's pawn to advance further or giving up the rook for the pawn, both leading to a positional advantage for white. The rook's retreat to a more active file now threatens to pierce the defensive structure with its newfound freedom.